So here's my goal. And when I teach contracts, I don't have a format. We basically are going to read through the contract. We're going to use scripts on how to explain the different parts of the contract to your clients. And then really highlight on areas that I've been seeing in the last 4 to 6 weeks, 3 months, whatever, of things that we just need to keep an eye on. Obviously, we're going to spend more time on the parts that have more issues and less time on the boring parts. But that doesn't mean there are any parts that are more important than the other. We're going to cap it at an hour and a half. If it takes an hour and a half, great. If we only get through 2 pages in an hour and a half, then we'll have to continue. But I know an hour and a half is really the attention span that we have when it comes to contracts. So I want to make sure that I'm respectful of that. So if you have questions, obviously you can speak up. You can type them into, if you're on Zoom, you can type them into the chat box, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But I'm going to go ahead and jump onto the contract now. Yes.
Can we talk quickly about an addendum before you do that?
Yes.
So with countering.
And I'll repeat all the questions for those of you that are on Zoom.
So with countering an offer.
Yes.
I submit an offer.
Yes.
The sellers counter it back on the original contract.
Okay.
My buyers want to counter again.
Mm-hmm.
Is this when I use an addendum for that counter?
So the question was, you're representing the buyer, right?
Correct.
So she's representing the buyer, submitted an offer. The sellers countered on the offer form, and now your buyers want to counter back.
They didn't counter on the offer form. They took the original contract.
Sorry, they countered on the original. They struck. Let's just say they struck
Correct.
The price.
Correct.
If it's legible, I prefer that you keep it on the contract, because then it's all in one document. Now, what that does bring up, and something that we'll talk about today, is I am also a fan of clean contracts being drawn up once you have a ratified contract. So if you have a counter of a counter of a counter, you can always, after you get ratified, you can go in, you can draw up a completely clean contract that matches it. Some agents don't love it because they're like, well, what if it's different? So you can even put a stipulation in there that says this is a clean contract and doesn't change any of the terms. But that's always the cleanest way to do it. Attorneys like it. People like it as well. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And the question the agent had was, I had the seller, right? My agent was the seller.
Okay.
And what offer form, signed counter offer form. His question to me was, does that mean he's completely ratified, even though the contract itself doesn't have 2 sets of signatures and doesn't have the right stuff on it?
Right. So the question was negotiating on a counter offer form, and the counter offer form itself is ratified. And then the question was, does that mean if there weren't matching signatures on the actual document on the form 310, is it a ratified contract? And the answer is yes. Yet that's the risk of a counteroffer form, is because you also now have the document. So again, if you're using counteroffer forms, great idea to go in and use a clean contract once you have it ratified. That way, and again, it makes you look good. I've said, I was taught very early on is, the smartest agent in the deal needs to have control of the contract. So you should be the smartest agent in the deal. And that means you should be the one that kind of draws up the clean one at the end. Regardless of who you think should do it, it should be you. You more than likely have it by default anyway, and it'll take 2 seconds to draw up a new contract. Again, you don't go overboard. If it were one counter on price, right, and it's pretty obvious, you don't need to go draw up a new one from that standpoint. Yes?
Is there a benefit of the counteroffer form versus on form 310?
So, yeah, so the question is there a benefit on the counteroffer form versus using form 310? And the answer is yes, it's cleaner. Unfortunately for me, it's a separate, my brain goes to, it's a separate document. So what ties them together, right? And there's a little bit too much, in my opinion, too much room for mistakes.
So sometimes I will use where I sort of blank out the other, instead of striking out,
right,
I'll put a text box.
Okay.
And put the new price there, so you're not seeing that chain. Are
Yeah.
you okay with that?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So what Laura said, if you didn't hear her, she said sometimes instead of striking something, she'll just put a text box over the top. And that way there's not, a change of a change of a change of a change. Just know that just like anything else, that needs to be initialed, and then the initials need to be closed from that standpoint.
This is a privilege to have you as our new broker.
Oh,
Discuss
boy.
what you want, because We want you to be happy.
Oh, yeah. Laura said that she's speaking for everyone by saying that everyone wants me to be happy. So that's why it's good we're having this. Let me make sure. Okay, let me go to the chat. I got a question here. Can we stop the questions and get to the contract? Oh, Gene. I see. Oh, fiery. All right, I see how it is. So let's jump into this. Yes, we can. But you're not allowed to ask any questions from here forward after that. All right. So the first part of the contract, pretty self-explanatory. This is where you're going to put the parties into the contract. Nothing really big to go into here. It defines who, what the definite, or gives the definitions of certain parts of who is part of the contract, who the parties are, who the brokers are. A big question I get in this all the time is what happens if a closing attorney is not put in item C on this page. It doesn't make the contract voidable. It's not binding. It's a closing attorney is selected by the buyer. It does not mean that the seller has to use it. This doesn't change at all. We've just put that on there. They added that to there. So people have clarification, hopefully early on. We also need to understand that this may not always be the same as the escrow agent. So just make sure you're mindful of that. Effective date, I do look at this one because the effective date is actually the final date upon which the party to the negotiating places the final and required signatures. So effective date obviously is the date that the contract was ratified. It will also, effective date will also have to do with deadlines, right? So the effective date of the due diligence is the due diligence deadline. The effective date of repair procedure is the repair procedure deadline. So that just something to keep in mind on there. Again, we have another option here in the new contract, not again, but one of the additions is at this point, this is where you can acknowledge, you have the buyer and seller acknowledge again that they've read the disclosure and they've decided they're going to be a customer, bless you, or a client. This does not replace, currently does not replace having the agency disclosure signed. You still have to have that as part of your required paperwork. And I'm going to keep checking to make sure I don't miss any of the chats. Okay. Okay. Yes. Oh, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay. Purchase price. Obviously, this is self-explanatory. The thing that we get a little confused on this one is unless they're getting 100% financing, it technically is a combination of financing and cash. It's not technically just financing. So, funds via finance would technically mean it's 100% financing. Not a hill I die on in negotiation, to be honest with you, because they're going to give you all the stipulations of the financing as it when it gets to the financing paragraph. Something to keep in mind. Listing agents, just huge important thing here is you want to make sure that you are reading this to make sure it's not inadvertently checked that it is contingent on a home selling, because they're not required to put in the accompanying Form 504, which gives any sort of kick-out clause or anything. Unfortunately, we've seen a couple of times where this is checked off right here where it says it is contingent on here and it was just missed by everyone, got ratified. All of a sudden they realize this buyer's under contract to purchase their home but has to sell their home that's not even on the market yet, and it was just overlooked. So make sure it's checked on here. If it is not checked, I don't like anything to be blank. So if I were the listing agent, I would make sure that was checked, and I'd even go as far as to initial it, because if you get an offer on your listing, and let's just say it was a full price offer, everything was clean, cash, everything, but they didn't check that, and you checked it, you then have to have it initialed by your seller and have it initialed by the buyer because it's a change that you made to the contract. Again, just something to keep an eye on. Pause for a second. I always look at contracts of what does the contract look like when something goes wrong, right? So if you fast forward down the road, for instance, we got a demand letter yesterday on a closing that happened in 2016, right? So what does that contract look like, and where did we cross all the T's and dot all the I's? So that this is, I go a little extreme on this, just so you know what to keep an eye out. But then I'll also tell you areas that are going to be worth pushing back when it comes to negotiation. All right. So paragraph 3, this is the part about describes the property that's being purchased. It describes everything to it. A couple things, I'm not going to read line by line, but a couple things that I do want to point out on this one is it does clarify ahead of time some things that need to be done prior to going under contract. It also clarifies that your client is obligated to keep the property in working condition. By the way, your seller has already agreed to do that with their listing agreement. One thing that's has come up a couple of times is, let's see, where are we? Seller agrees. Where it talks about the improvements, right? When it describes the property is also the improvements. So we did have a repair procedure contract last week. One of the requests on the repair procedure contract was to fix the gate. The gate was falling off, and the buyer side argued that's structural. The fence is an improvement on the property. The fence is not structurally sound. It needed to be fixed. Again, probably not a winning battle on the buyer's side, but definitely opened up the question of if it's a fence and it's structural and there's a structural issue with the fence, it's an improvement on the property. So just be careful on that one. I'll have to get back to you on really where that one's going to go. I don't think the buyer's going to win it, but just understand you got to explain this to the client. Here's one we're seeing a lot of, particularly in repair procedures, this line right here. This line is basically saying that your buyer acknowledges the opportunity to inquire about the owner's association, any issues, common area issues, condominium master deed issues, assignment of parking, memberships, lease issues, and finance equipment prior to signing the contract. This is big. If you go into a repair procedure and everything's great on the repair procedure and you know everyone agrees on that, but let's say you find out that the HOA has some sort of issue with the master deed, or they have an assessment, or they have something that's coming up with that your client doesn't like, they've already agreed and acknowledged that they needed to look at all that up ahead of time. So if you're going into a neighborhood or one with an association and your buyer is concerned about anything, it's their obligation and their right to do that research ahead of time. So just keep that in mind. This one has just recently popped up a couple of times. For instance, we have one right now that we're in dispute where the HOA is under lawsuit. Right now, there's an issue of whether or not that was properly disclosed, which I get, but what the seller side is now arguing to say, listen, the lawsuit was there for you to know about before you went under contract, right? Extreme situation, albeit I'll admit that. However, just something to keep in mind, but this is a big one. Any HOA research should be done ahead of time. Again, unless you're doing due diligence, which at that point doesn't matter, you can do that research for due diligence, okay? Okay, so address. From a brokerage standpoint, I'll just tell you the most important things on here on the address are the street address, the city, the zip, the county, and the tax map number. All the rest of the stuff, if you can get it, great. If you can't, at least put a line in it. Just don't leave it blank. You just don't like blanks. That's the only thing that I ask for. As far as personal property, no personal property will convey except described below. If this is something like the refrigerator or kitchen appliances, you can put it on here. If you're talking about a long list of furniture and stuff like that, you need to attach a bill of sale and talk to the lender about how they want to do that from a value standpoint. Again, not to get into basics and case study 101, but if you come in and they like the refrigerator, you need to say, here, please do not put appliances as seen when showing the property on June 1st, 2020, or as mentioned in the MLS. Neither one of those will hold up. So if you want a refrigerator, you want refrigerator Maytag model number XYZ. So you need to be very specific about this, because if you put refrigerator, they take their Viking fridge and put in their beer fridge from the garage, they've conveyed a refrigerator. So you want to be very specific on personal property that's going to be conveying in this paragraph. Okay?
So if a nicer appliance, you would suggest calling the name?
I would. So the question was on a nicer appliance, suggest calling the name. On any appliance, I would, because again, the cleanest contract wins. And that's a clean contract. Just whatever you do, don't reference the MLS. The MLS is nothing more than a property flyer. So you just want to make sure that you don't default to that. And if you do that, please stop. All right, page 2. Look at that. Now we're cooking. We're 15 minutes into this. We're already on page 2. All right, conveyance, closing, possession. This is the closing date. The best thing about this is there's no longer a grace period, or what did they call them? What were the days? Automatic extension. That no longer exists. This is the closing date. Closing date is not TBD, right? If you're not sure because of contingencies, then you put a closing date out further. You can always meet deadlines early per the contract. You can't extend deadlines or dates without everyone agreeing, right? So you can always do things earlier. Well, closing, it's hard to close early if they don't all agree. But as far as you're changing the contract by making it later. So if you don't know, do worst case scenario and to open the negotiations. Big question here is, does this, honestly, I'm not positive why they left this blank in here as far as how the names are going to be on the deed, because quite honestly, that's handled directly with the attorney. Whether or not this is filled out does not make it a valid or voidable contract. So if you're representing the seller, they come in and they don't have this filled out, again, not something I'd push back on, because honestly, they're going to take care of that through the closing attorney. All right, so paragraph 5. Paragraph 5 is the first time in the contract that the seller is allowed to unilaterally cancel the contract. Paragraph 5 talks about your earnest money. Quick clarification, 0 is acceptable for earnest money. I'm not saying it's recommended, but a lot of times, or I've seen it before, an offer comes in, 0 for earnest money. Someone says that's not valid because it has to be a certain amount. It does not have to be a certain amount. Again, I'm not recommending you do it. I just want to clarify, if that's done, don't go back arguing saying you have to have it or it's not a valid contract. Things that are important on this is you want to make sure the total that's coming in is going to be the sum of what's accompanying the offer as well as what will be paid by 6 p.m. on whatever date. Okay, so a lot of times the total is going to be here, and then they're going to have however much because they've submitted the earnest money when they submitted the offer. Whether or not it's submitted after the fact, I'm not real attached to that. However, as a listing agent, well, and for that being said, as a buyer's agent, if there's a date in here, you need to put this on your reminder to make sure, John Crompton says hi, everyone, to make sure that you're confirming that the earnest money has been submitted and received. Okay. Let me, okay.
I thought the buyer's name go in that blank. I assume you're talking about the deed blank.
Yeah, that's what it's designed for. So the question was, I thought that the buyer's name goes in the blank of paragraph 4. It can, but what this is doing is this is basically saying how the property will be deeded, right? And so, and it's in the ownership type and all that is determined by the buyer. So whether or not, this is not something that has to be agreed upon by the seller. So whether or not it's in the contract is not necessarily needed. I'm not saying don't do it if you're the buyer's agent. I'm just saying if it's not in there, it's still valid. The reason I tell y'all things like this is because if you look at negotiation as a bandwidth, right? You only have so much bandwidth in your negotiation. So if you're coming back with negotiations and stuff like this, like, let's get the chatter out of there, right? Now I'm not saying don't be strict on your contracts, right? I'm not saying avoid signatures or initials, but things like that, if I'm coming back with a lot of other counters, I'm not worried about that. Kind of the point on that one.
I have a quote.
Yes.
Rigor leads to rigor mortis.
Rigor leads to rigor mortis. Okay.
You're being so rigid
Yeah.
and like about that it can just.
Yeah, if you're too rigid on everything, well, here's the other thing that you can look at too, is everything is, if you treat everything as equally important, nothing's important, right? So you want to be careful on that. Okay, back to earnest money. So this is where we'll also say where the escrow agent is. For clarification, if you're new to Keller Williams or new into the business, we do not hold earnest money at KW. So if you're representing the buyer, your earnest money will more than likely be deposited with the closing attorney. We are working on having a standard document, just to side note a little bit, for compliance. So if you do submit earnest money, or if you're a listing agent, you want proof of earnest money that's coming in. Right now, if you have an email from the escrow agent, or if you have a form from them, you can absolutely use those. What we're going to have is we're having an attorney draw up a document just so you can have an official document that has the signed off, hey, we've received the escrow. Basically replacing page 8, which I'm glad they removed page 8, except for that part. Like, that was the most important part of it. Important part to know at this point right here, if the earnest money, this is the last paragraph or last sentence on that paragraph, if the earnest money is not delivered by the agreed upon date, the seller may terminate the contract by delivering notice of termination. It's not, they can renegotiate. It's not anything. You simply, and it states it later in the contract, you can send an email that says, per paragraph 5, we've not received the earnest money and we're terminating the contract. The buyer cannot argue that. The contract's over at that point. So it's super important that as a buyer's agent, you make sure it's in, and it's super important as a listing agent, if you don't get the earnest money, you advise your client on it. Okay?
This is what you're referring to as unilateral.
Yeah, so this is the first area where there's an opportunity to unilaterally terminate the contract.
Suggested reasonable number of days.
Yeah, so the question on this is reasonable number of days to receive the earnest money. Yeah, it's short, as little as possible. So you're wearing 2 hats, right? So as a listing agent, I want it right now. I want it in, I want it right now, done. As the buyer, I mean, I don't want to, honestly, as the buyer's agent, I don't want to be carrying around the check, which, by the way, the license law, just because we don't hold escrow, the license law doesn't change. If they give you a check, you have to get it. It's not a time frame, it's immediately. That's how it's described in the LLR. So if they hand you a check, you immediately need to turn it over, right? So, I mean, you drive to the attorney's office or whatever it is, or you just have them send it directly to them, which is the best case scenario. But I don't see why that should be any more than a business day, to be honest with you, unless it's some extreme situation where they're out of town, they didn't have their checkbook and they're going to overnight it. I would tighten it up as much as possible. We have seen instances where a buyer has ratified a contract, said they're going to mail the earnest money, had the inspection done, repair procedure, didn't like what was done in the or didn't like what came up on the inspection, said, you know what, we're not even going to ask for it, and we're not going to turn in our earnest money. And it wasn't due yet, right? So, I mean, at that point, they still could lose earnest money and they could be liable for it. You're going to chase somebody down and have them write an earnest money check that they know that they're going to lose. It's hard. Now, I did get a question yesterday, and by the way, I say these questions because they're not the only time they were asked. I'm not repeating these questions. I don't even know if the person who asked it is in the class, but I say these as a learning experience, and that you know that you're not the only one who asked it. So don't take any judgment. I'm not shaming anyone. The question was, as a listing agent, do we need to have proof of the earnest money, of the escrow? Because, you know, that's really the buyer side. You absolutely should. It's your obligation, actually, as the listing agent, to make sure the earnest money was turned in to avoid a situation like we just talked about, right? So you need to have that on your calendar. Hey, did the earnest money come in? Okay. All right. Let's jump down. All right. So this paragraph right here, this is the one that basically, this all bold paragraph, we do a really bad job of describing this paragraph. Because what this paragraph says is Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, regardless of how black and white it may be that the other party defaulted on the contract, this paragraph says right here that the escrow agent by law cannot release the escrow money unless they have an agreement authorizing the disbursement. Now, that agreement starts between you and the buyer, or you and the seller, depending on who your client is, or it's an order by the court, or it's a mediation that you've agreed on. It's really important to explain this because a lot of times, particularly sellers think, you know what, we've got $2,000 in earnest money, it's worth the risk, we'll just keep their earnest money. It ain't that easy. The buyer could come in, write a contract on the house, turn in their earnest money, be the day before closing and say, I don't like the color of the house anymore. That is as black and white as you can get that they're defaulting. Your seller just doesn't automatically get the earnest money. And you just need to explain that to them, because at the end of the day, I always go back to the quote, conflict only arises when there's a difference in expectation, right? So if they're expecting that they're just going to get it, you need to change that expectation for them. Now, some people will argue, well, then what's the point of the earnest money? And I'll argue that's a great question, because at the end of the day, you could argue because of this paragraph, what is the point of the earnest money? You should be writing a contract that's going to get you to closing, not writing a contract that's going to get you earnest money. Like that's kind of how you want to look at it. All right, let me double check. Okay. Any questions from you guys so far? I know we're going to spend a lot of time on paragraph 8, so I'm just going to keep hammering through. All right, so paragraph 6, this is where it maps out what transaction costs are. Okay, it does say in here buyer's transaction costs. It basically lists anything that the money could be allocated to, right? There's really nothing that's off limits in this one. It also talks about the seller's transaction costs. The second paragraph here, this is awesome because what this new contract has done, a lot of people don't like it, and quite honestly, that comes from most people that don't like it don't understand it. The new contract is about as clean of a contract that we've had in South Carolina in a long time, because it cleared up a lot of gray area. This was one of them. So at this point, this is where you're going to select who's responsible for the transaction costs as it relates to the HOA, certificate of assessment, capital contributions, working capital, estoppel fees, any other similar fees. If you are a listing agent, as a side note, part of your listing presentation and your listing process prior to going on the market needs to be confirming whether or not there is a contribution fee in the HOA. We had a closing earlier this year where they had voted in a capital contribution like the month before the people decided to sell their house. They had no idea that there was one in there. This was before the contract had changed, and it defaulted to the seller. And what happened was the seller ended up being responsible for a capital call or a contribution cost, which they shouldn't have been. And it was part of the listing agent's duty is to make sure you research that. Okay. It does say who's going to pay it on this one. That's the good thing, but don't just default to the seller because you think there isn't one, right? It does say though, if no box is checked, these costs will be added to the seller's transaction costs. It didn't clarify that before. So typically what paralegals would do is split them. This specifically says if nothing's checked, then it's billed to the seller. Question always at this point comes, if you're negotiating, which one should you check? The other side. I mean, that's, unless you're in a multiple offer situation and you're trying to be competitive, just becomes part of the negotiations. Now, if you've confirmed with the association that there's no contribution fee or anything like that, do you use up your emotional or your negotiation bandwidth on this? Probably not. Probably not. Emotional is correct. All right. Next paragraph of paragraph 6. This talks about where seller will pay buyer's transaction costs. Yes, it only allows the dollar amount now. It doesn't allow the percentage. I don't love it either because you have to change it when you change your negotiation of the price. Before you could say 3% and it was just 3% of whatever the price was going to be. That was great. Now, if you change the price, you've got to change this one as well. Here's where we see a lot of mistakes happen, and this is very clearly says what happens in this situation. You put in an offer on a house for $300,000. You say they want $9,000 in closing costs because that's roughly 3%. This paragraph right here says if the amount exceeds the amount of those costs or amount allowed, very important part here, allowed by the lender. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it's considered a closing cost or buyer cost or not. It's what's allowed by the lender. So if that happens, any excess funds revert to the seller. So it's very important if you're representing a buyer and you come into this, that you are in very good communication with the lender, because what you don't want to do is say, yeah, they agree to pay $9,000 in closing costs, and then you find out the lender only allowed $6,000. Well, now there's $3,000 windfall that the seller got because it goes right back in their pocket. And so you want to make sure you're clear on that. And just so we're clear, I'm not saying this question has ever been asked of me. No, that difference cannot be paid to the buyer outside of closing. That's not part of the negotiations, anything like that. This is, I joke, I actually had a buyer's agent say, hey, he sent it in an email, said, hey, if you will, can you have the seller just write the buyer a check and leave it in the kitchen, the cabinet, or in the cabinet in the kitchen drawer? No, we cannot. That is not legal. And then obviously if there's no closing, yes.
Can you change that to a percentage if you choose to?
So good question. The question was, could you change that to a percentage if you choose to? The short answer is yes. The debate that comes in this is, are you changing a contract? And is that practicing law? Changing a dollar sign to a percentage. I'll be honest, back when I was, walking to work 4 miles in the snow, it used to be this way, and we changed it to the percentage. It's easier to negotiate. If you do that, by the way, by doing so, you're going to have to strike the dollar sign, write in a percentage sign. You've now changed the pre-printed. So you have to have that initialed. Okay, so you have to bring a lot of attention to it to make sure to do so. But the short answer is yes. Well, and then you could exceed, 6%, you would need to put of purchase price or whatever percent it would be. The reason this was taken out, FYI, is honestly, in my opinion, is because of the placement of the old contract, because that percentage was right at the end of the line. We actually had one that they agreed to pay 3%, and nobody saw it on the seller side. They accepted the contract, got to closing, saw 3% in closing costs that they're responsible for. The seller had never even seen it. So that's the other challenge of having the percentage. It's like one digit that was hidden. So you just want to make sure it's highlighted, bells, horns, make sure everybody knows about it. All right, unless otherwise agreed upon, the buyer and seller are going to be responsible for the closing costs as mapped out in the beginning of the paragraph. All right, I can tell by the excitement on everyone's face that this is the topic that you love, which is contracts. And we are officially on page 3. Financing. Here's the number one thing to look at on this paragraph right here. Financing contingency expires at closing. Very, very important. This basically was to correct all of the agents that were putting final loan approval at blank date, and everybody was just writing what? Closing. So they said, you know what? We'll just write it for you. So the final approval will not happen until closing. Now, you can get this elusive pre-final loan approval, and you can put a date there, but it's very specific of what that means. You don't have any no unreasonable credit income or asset conditions. You don't have any repairs that are still outstanding or anything like that. So you can have that, but this date right here, you still are not completely out of the woodwork when you get past this date, right? So you just want to make sure. Now, the best way to help prevent this and any issues with that is to make sure you're in clear communication with the lender. Listing agents. I get a question all the time. Is it okay for me to reach out to the buyer's lender? Legally and protocol wise, yes. What is the best way to handle that though? Yes. That's it. Reach out ahead of time, introduce yourself. Hey, I'm the listing agent. Maybe even go as far as copying the buyer's agent on there. Again, we are in this together. We have one goal, and that is to get the buyer and seller happily through the transaction to close. So just do that early. If you start getting into the testy time and you're emailing, Laura, where are we? Where are we? And Laura's like, I don't know. And then all of a sudden you send an email to Laura's buyer's lender. Well, now Laura's going to be aggravated because you didn't trust. She's going to say, well, why didn't you listen to me? It's like, well, let's just all communicate on this one. Some people disagree. Some people don't think you should be reaching out directly to the buyer's lender. I personally don't operate that way. It is okay to do that.
I think if you reach out ahead of time, the buyer's lender then is oftentimes going to just keep you in.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to give away any information about their client that you shouldn't have.
Yeah.
But hey, look, we made it through this, or we got these documents, or whatever.
Yeah.
So you don't even have to make that a reach out. But I'm like you, if you don't do that up front,
Mm-hmm.
it's very difficult to involve yourself in that process when the buyer gets burned.
Yeah. So for those of you on Zoom, what Lynn was saying is, it 9 times out of 10, honestly 9.9 times out of 10, if you do this early on, the lender just starts to include you in all correspondence, right? They start to, and you offer to help. What can I get you? Do you need anything? Let me know if you need anything from this end. And then you're not waiting until something is starting to slip south and emotions are getting high that you're bringing them in at that point. Question on this one. When should they be applying? This first date, quite honestly, this should be very tight. They should be applying within 1 day. This doesn't need to be 5 business days, anything like that. If they don't have their stuff together enough to apply for the loan within 1 day of writing a contract on a house, there's a risk there. It's a red flag. Again, negotiation bandwidth, a couple days. I don't know that I'd freak out. Long periods of time, I'd be okay with. Yes.
Most of the people I deal with are pre-qualified already, ready to go. You just put 1 day in there.
Yeah. So the question was, is if you're working with a buyer that's pre-qualified, ready to go, or is already applied, So you still need to put something in there. Just put in the one day. You can put it in the same day of, well, you don't want to put it in the same day of negotiations because it could take a day or two. But yeah, you want to do it quickly. And then, by the way, it all comes back to communication. This is the binding document. That doesn't mean in your email when you submit the offer, you can't say, by the way, they've already applied to financing. So that date is just in there to be in there. Okay, so, all right, if buyer, here's an important one that's different. If buyer changes their lender during the financing period, they must notify the seller in writing within blank calendar days. There's two parts of this that are very, very important. The first part is if you come in with a pre-approval lender, a pre-approval letter from a certain lender, and you're then going to change your lender, you're now required by the contract to let the seller know within the time period that's put on here. Okay, so this gives you permission to change lenders. So there's nothing wrong with changing lenders, except part 2 of this. Absent written approval by the seller, buyer cannot change the lender if the closing date agreed upon in paragraph 4 will change as a direct result. So it's 2 parts. You're welcome to change lenders, but if you change a lender and it changes the closing date, then you may be in default of the contract. So super important to understand that there. And buyer, and again, you just need to explain that to your buyer. I understand that you're still shopping around, but if you change lenders and it changes the closing date because you changed lenders, then they don't have to change the date. And by the way, at that point in the contract, you would be in default because you haven't moved forward on the financing that you agreed to do. Okay. Okay. This is where you list your lender. Obviously, you want to pay attention to what type of loan it is. As the listing agent, you want to make sure you're not accepting offers with financing that would be risky. As a buyer's agent, you want to be presenting offers with financing that would be risky. We're seeing a lot now with condominiums and different associations where they may not be approved by different types of lending. Don't trust the MLS. If you do have someone who does have lending, if they do have VA or FHA lending and there is a risk, you want to do the research. The MLS is nothing more than an advertisement. You can't come back to the listing agent and say, hey, you said it was an FHA. It's an advertisement. Is it poor advertising? Sure, but don't get wrapped up in that one. So the question that Kristen asked is how many days for the final pre-approval day? You know, I'm going to default to always asking the lender, right? Because every lender is going to be different. I think I've heard anything as reasonable as 15 days for those that can get closed quickly. As the buyer side, I want to give as much time as possible to get that approval done. From the seller side, I want it as tight as possible. This is your lawyer answer, by the way, right? Right down the middle. It depends on who you represent. You know, at the end of the day, you want to communicate with the lender. I don't think you should have, if you have a closing date of July 30th, I don't think you should have a pre-final approval of July 28th, right? I mean, you want to, unless you have a short closing period. But I would say anywhere from 20, 25 days is probably pretty standard on that one. All right. Everybody take a deep breath. All right. No, not a yawn. A deep breath. Raise your right hand. Raise your right hand. I can only say, okay. And repeat after me. I promise not to freak out on trying to understand paragraph 8. All right. Awesome. I feel that you're all completely committed to this. Okay. All right, so here's what we're going to do to talk about paragraph 8. We're going to start at 30,000 feet, and then we're going to come in for landing on each one of the parts. All right, so in any contract, by the way, I'm going to describe this how I would describe it to the client. Okay, so in any contract to sell real estate, there's going to be a condition of the property contingency. Okay, where the buyer and the seller are going to have some sort of agreement on how much the buyer can do, how much they can ask for, and how long it takes. So in South Carolina, we have 3 options. We have what's called the repair procedure, okay, which is pre-approved, pre-agreed upon repairs. We have due diligence, which means the buyer is not agreeing to anything until they've inspected the property. Or we have as is. As is saying, I'm buying the house regardless of what I find out, okay? So those are our 3 options. Repair procedure is the one we're going to start with. Repair procedure basically says, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, that you're going to have all repair inspections and requests done by this date. Now, this is different from before, just for those of you that are catching up with the new contract. It used to be you'd have the inspections done by this date and then requests done by this date. This is inspections and requests done by this date. Okay, so Mr. Buyer, what we'll do is we'll send an inspector out there. They're going to inspect the property. You can inspect on anything. You can inspect from the angle that the sun comes in to the foundational integrity of the house. Anything that you want to inspect, you can absolutely inspect. What the repair procedure says, though, is the only thing the seller agrees to repair is stated in this paragraph right here. Okay, so when we do the inspection, any and all requests necessary to place the heating system, air conditioning system, electrical, plumbing, water supply, water waste, to convey them in operative condition, or if the roof is leaking, or to address any environmental concerns, or to make the property structurally sound, if any of that happens, the seller has the right to address it. And Mr. Buyer, if we go out there and the house is sinking in one corner and the roof is leaking terribly over the garage, and you get terrified about the house, when we let the seller know, if they agree to fix both of those items, you still have to purchase the property. We are agreeing ahead of time on what repairs the sellers are going to do. Okay, so you just need to explain that to them. Now, Mr. Buyer, can you ask for things outside the scope of this? You absolutely can. And if they say no, you don't have grounds to cancel the contract. Okay, you're basically going in and saying, hey, this is what we're all agreeing on. Now, Mr. Buyer is going to say, why would I agree to do this one? Well, we're in a competitive market. We're in a multiple offer situation. We're going in low on price. We're doing something where this makes the rest of this is a strong part of the contract, so we can be, we can negotiate more at another part, or we can put ourselves ahead of the schedule. It's not a terrible thing for a buyer. It's not, unless it's me as the buyer, right? I want due diligence, right? I want to get out for any reason at all. Now, once you get this inspection, they then have to get you the request by this date. A couple things to note on this. The request is simply a notice, by the way. This is not a repair addendum. It can be. It doesn't have to be on the repair addendum. It should be in a uniform manner to say, here is what we've noticed, so you can agree on it. The seller then has however long you put into this line here to whether or not they agree or don't agree to make the repairs that are included and repeated right here in the paragraph. Okay, it even goes as far to say they do not include the following: general home maintenance, flooring, fogged windows, which, by the way, were the biggest ones that were always a challenge, grandfathered code issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, energy efficiency. If seller contractually agrees to make all requested seller paid repairs, the parties agree to proceed under the amended contract. The repairs to any other items are the sole responsibility of the buyer. It is as clear as it can be. Now, here's where we get into things. And here's how you need to explain this. It is your job, this is your fiduciary responsibility to explain to the buyer, hey, we're looking at a house in Brickyard. It was built in the 90s. It's got the original HVAC on there. We were in the house. It was cooling, right? It was working. If this comes up and it's original, the inspector is going to say, recommend replace. That does not matter. It is functioning. Its original roof should have been replaced 10 years ago. It is not leaking. It is not covered. Again, you don't want to scare your buyer out of it. However, this is where we are seeing the biggest challenge is buyers don't understand it. And I get it from a buyer standpoint. If they didn't understand that they've already agreed on this ahead of time, they come in, they go into a house, and they're out there with the inspector, and you've got inspector alarmist out there, and he's like, God, I can't believe this roof's still on. This thing's 30-something years old. It should have been replaced years ago. Oh my gosh, then they needed to replace it. It's general maintenance. Or that's stupid if they didn't replace it. Doesn't matter. You've already agreed upon it in here. Okay. I know it's great. It's enlightening news. Now, here's the deal. If the seller does not timely respond per above or does not agree to make the repairs, the buyer shall within 2 calendar days. So 2 calendar days here from this date here, the buyer can choose The buyer has now, if you do not respond in time, the buyer can then choose in 2 calendar days to accept the property as it is, negotiate a new amended, or terminate the contract. If the buyer, very, very important, if the buyer fails to accept, renegotiate, or terminate within the 2 calendar days, everyone agrees to move forward as is. Okay? So Laura comes in. She submits the repair request to me and says, here's what we found. Hopefully they've given me enough time where I'm going to go do the research to see whether or not I'm going to agree to do it. I come back to her and I say, we still need more time. We're meeting with our contractors. This date goes by here. And then within 2 calendar days, if Laura doesn't do anything, Laura has agreed to move forward on the property as is. That does not mean if I'm the listing agent and I see the deadline of this 2 calendar days comes up, I keep my mouth shut because yay, they're moving forward as is. Because at the end of the day, they're not moving forward as is. You're just creating a lawsuit at that point. Okay, so again, communication is key in all of these. It specifically states when it needs to happen, who needs to do it, what happens if it's not done. That does not mean, again, what I say earlier, the goal of this is not to win the earnest money. The goal of this is to go through a smooth transaction that the buyer and seller are happy with. Okay? And then it states here what as is means, which basically means to buy the property at the purchase price while they maintain the property from the effective date through closing. Okay? Repair procedure. Due diligence. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's the second option, or here's what they've asked for. They basically said they have a due diligence period that will expire at 6 p.m. on this date right here. If they don't like anything about the house whatsoever, including but not limited to the way the sun shines at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, they can get out. It's not perfect, but it's also not the end of the world. I understand that you want to be protected, Mr. Seller. It's a beautiful house. I agree. It's the best house I've ever seen in my 20 years of being in real estate. However, a buyer wants to come in and inspect every single thing about it. This gives them a way to get out during the due diligence period. So if you're going to agree to this, and I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, by the way, on all my listings, I always recommend, unless it's an extreme situation, that they counter and ask for a repair procedure. I just do, unless it's like an investment property or something where I know there's going to be a bunch of stuff going on there. If you agree to this, just know you should treat this contract as not being fully ratified until we get through due diligence. And that's just how you explain it to them. I just basically summarized in human terms, like what everything else says right here, right? It does tell you everything needs to be done. It tells what they're supposed to be, like who's responsible for what, the inspections they're supposed to have. It does not state, that they're required to inspect. It also doesn't state that they have to be inspected by a licensed inspector. This literally can be, they don't like the traffic. You need to explain to your seller that it's that open-ended.
I came from the due diligence state. We only have due diligence
Right.
in North Carolina. And so the verbiage I use is they can walk away for any reason or absolutely no reason.
Yeah.
They can wake up and decide they don't want in and they're done.
Yeah. So what Lynn said, it's a great script. She is they can walk away for any reason or no reason. And that's absolutely right. Like they don't have to have a reason. Again, your job's not to scare them. Your job is to educate them. It's not always bad for a seller to accept due diligence. It's not always necessary for a buyer to ask for due diligence, right? It all depends on each situation. Now, again, in the general world, if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm always asking for due diligence. I'm a seller agent. I'm always countering it, repair procedure, right? You have to come to a meeting of the minds. Now, also understand that we don't really see this as much as when it first came out, is it isn't, you submit something that you want done by the date above. Like this date above, you have to have submitted, negotiated, and agreed on everything that's going to be done from the inspection period by that date. If that does not happen during the due diligence period, should buyer fail to obtain a new amended contract with the seller or to timely, properly terminate the contract, then the buyer agrees to buy and the seller agrees to sell as is. So if you go past this date up here and you have not at least submitted a termination, you've agreed to buy the house as is. Now, again, What if the buyer doesn't know this and you didn't properly explain these deadlines to them? I can promise you your buyer's not going to say, you know what, honest mistake, I'll move forward and buy the house as is. Not what's going to happen. You're just going to create a fight. So just make sure you have the communications with them. All right.
And maybe the point when you get to that point, if the seller's not getting back to you about repairs and stuff, you need to have the termination prepared and ready to go, and say to the selling agent, we're on the time crunch here,
Mhm.
by 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock tonight, we're sending over the termination at 5:45 if I don't have it.
Yeah. So what Lynn was saying, and a great point, is if you're getting down to the wire on this, because by the way, if you're representing the seller, they're going to submit this to you. You're going to need time to do the research of what you can and can't do. So if you know, today it's Wednesday at 3:30, if this is due tomorrow, I'm right now possibly drawing up the termination. And and if they don't hear from them, say, listen, we need time to respond. You haven't given us time to respond. So I have 2 documents I can send you, Mr. Buyer's agent. I can send you the termination agreement, or I can send you an extension on the due diligence, right? But we need something from you in enough time for us to get a response. That's what's important about this. If you're if this, the top of paragraph, the due diligence, if they've got tomorrow at 6 and they submit it to you that morning, you're under a pressure cooker to do the research to find out what you're going to do. And by the way, from a buyer's agent standpoint, that's not a good negotiation tactic. And some of you would argue with me, and that's totally fine. You can argue with me, but it doesn't help. All you're really doing is annoying the seller at that point. The seller's not going to be like, oh my gosh, I have to decide quickly, so I'm just going to do it all. They're probably actually going to go the other route. So just give time, communicate, and make sure that you're all on the same page with the time frames. All right, so question here, termination fee. We're starting to see these creep up a little bit more. What this is this basically says if you do terminate, you can unilaterally terminate the contract only by delivering the seller both notice of termination and a termination fee of blank. What are y'all seeing for numbers on here? I mean, if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm putting 0 every time. If I'm a listing agent, I'm countering back to say, and here's what I'll caution you on. It's good to have your standards as an agent, but also understand you represent a client. I have a lot of people that are hard and fast as listing agents. It's $5,000. I tell my sellers it should be $5,000 every time, whatever the number may be. It's the seller's really call at this point. And you can say to the seller, what's it worth to take your house off the market for however many weeks this is? If they terminate, are you okay with them terminating because they're going to pay you $1,000 or $500? What is it? Include the seller in that. If they ask you for your opinion, you can then start having the discussion. Okay, well, if you take it off the market for 2 weeks and they back out, what's a half a mortgage payment?
Right, and that was the intention, I think, for that we were told, was the intention of that termination fee was meant to be the number of days you're asking for it to be off the market. And ours was different than that. You had no financial intention of nothing. When that ended,
You're done. Yeah.
And so we saw that fee pick up pretty quickly, but a lot of people put 0 here. I would, as a seller, never say 0. We have a question.
Okay, yeah, let me repeat what you said and we'll go to the question. So what Lynn was saying was the original intent of this fee was to mirror kind of what the time frame is, right? So what does it cost the seller to be off the market? So think of it as a win-win. Mr. Buyer, I understand that you want free for all, and I get it. However, if you're going to do that, at least be willing to reimburse the buyer or the seller for taking their home off the market for 2 weeks. And that's what it is. And you can get out for whatever reason. You would be surprised. Don't put your limiting beliefs on this. You'd be surprised, especially if they're coming from other areas. These are not uncommon in other areas. We're one of the last states to still have anything other than a due diligence period. I mean, if you think about it from a conceptual standpoint, I mean, I haven't worked with a buyer in years, and I'm a listing agent at heart. If you think about it from a conceptual standpoint, due diligence should be the only option in a contract. Like, I mean, a buyer is buying a house. Like, we can argue all day long whether or not the house is structurally sound and the best house in the world. The buyer has to be comfortable buying the house at the end of the day. But until they have repair procedure as a listing agent, I'm still going to ask for it.
What do you do as a buyer? What do you recommend?
So the question was, what do you recommend to put in there as a buyer's agent? Again, because I'm negotiating for the buyer, I'm going to, do I start with 0? Probably not a great way to, well, you could still get away with it a little bit now. I'd put a couple $100 in there to start. $500, is it worth to you? It's a cost of doing it. Also based on price point, how long you're on there. I mean, The challenge is if you've got somebody who's a first-time home buyer, they're spending a couple $100 on an inspection, they're spending all this money. You know, by the way, this is a good argument of why repair procedure is good, because from a buyer standpoint, all right, I'm a first-time home buyer, I'm fairly handy. As long as these major systems are done, why wouldn't I want to do it? So, is that what the question was?
Kind of, I mean, we just see zero in there so much, and so, you know, I'm adamantly opposed to zero, only because I feel like whether you're, like you're asking a seller to take their house off the market for $0, and that also, in my opinion, gives me a little bit of insight as to how vested my buyer is in the property.
Yeah, so that's actually a good point. Lynn's comment was it also can give an indication of how vested your buyer is in purchasing the property. That's a good point. It is. I mean, again, at the end of the day, you're purchasing a home, so you're gonna be out costs to go through the process, right? So the question that was in the chat box in regards to repair procedure, fogged windows have frequently been a repair my clients have asked for. The sellers were willing to do it. The sellers didn't agree to fix their fogged windows, then my buyers would still be obligated to purchase. Correct. Yes. And that's one of the reasons they were mapped out in there. So there's two schools of thought on this. This was an issue a lot because unfortunately what was happening is sellers were doing this because they weren't being advised correctly. They'd come in, someone would say the windows are fogged, so you got to fix them. And it's clearly stated in there now. But so the other reason too, and this is a valid argument, if you've been in the property, you saw the fogged windows, right? So if the fogged windows are an issue, and by the way, as an agent, this is where you're going to have to take some responsibility and say, if you see it and you go with repair procedure, say, okay, just keep in mind those fogged windows are not covered in repair procedure. Now, also understand if you're, here's what you don't want to do, going back to repair procedure as a listing agent. I see a lot of listing agents respond very poorly to repair procedure requests that are above and beyond what's already agreed on. There are two agents that do that, okay? There is the agent that is asking you to repair what their buyer has asked you to ask them to repair, regardless of how often you've told them, we've already covered what's covered in here. This is outside of it, but they've asked you to do it. You have a fiduciary responsibility to ask. That's 90% of the time what's happening. Then there's the agent that everyone else seems to assume is doing this, and that's the moron. And you react accordingly. That's not appropriate. I see listing agents respond to this all the time, and they're like, don't you understand that this is not blah, 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 and they get stopped. Like that's not helpful in the negotiations, right? If you get a repair request that's completely out of line for a repair procedure, don't bring your emotion into how much smarter you are than the buyer's agent, because 9 times out of 10, they're asking for what their buyer asked for. And a lot of times my wife deals with this all the time. She'll have a buyer that says, listen, I understand, but there's really not a lot wrong with this house. We're asking for like one thing that's in the repair procedure. Let's just ask and see. Because a lot of times if they have a contractor coming out to service to fix a leaking hose in the air conditioning, they'll probably replace the drip pan for an extra $50. And they may be willing to do it. Some people have a giant pride of ownership that want to do it before they sell their house. My point is this, where the deals go south mainly on this is the emotions that agents bring in. And it's this, because they come back and trust me, I know this because I was that agent. I had these wonderful scripts that write back and say, well, as you know, that the repair procedure is a previously agreed upon repair, blah, 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 blah. All the buyer agent hears at that point is, I think you're stupid, right? And you're just not helping in the negotiation. I'm not saying you do it. You just go back to the negotiation. Now you may pick up the phone and say, hey, in your opinion, or I just want to let you know, I'm going to submit all of these. Tell me a little bit about your discussion with your buyer, because some of these are a little outside the scope of it. Totally willing to ask. Just wanted to kind of see where your buyer is on that.
So, one of the things I think is always good is like if I have a buyer that is asking for a lot of stuff and I know that I'm way outside of what's there, I would actually pick up the phone before I send the repair request over and say, hey, look, I've got a first-time home buyer. We've gone over repair procedure. We've gone over the documents. I'm sending over their request.
Mm-hmm.
Just get back and let me know, to try to keep the emotion at bay,
Yep.
so that they don't immediately jump down my throat.
Right.
Look, I'm going to try to work work with
Yep.
me, let's come to an agreement on this.
Yeah. So what Lynn was saying is along the same lines, which she has this novel idea in negotiation, which was to pick up the phone, right?
Not that
But it's a good point. Like, hey, I'm going to pick up the phone and say, Mr. and Mrs. Listing Agent, just want to let you know, I'm sending you the repair procedure. There are a handful of items on there. You still want to represent your buyer, right? So I just want to let you know that they're asking for these. They are a little nervous as a first-time home buyer. They do know that because this is covered under the repair procedure, if they're going to have a contractor out there, they wanted to know if the seller would be willing to do it. I'm telling you, seller, I mean, again, you're there to represent and dare I say, fight for your seller, right? But you're also there to communicate with your seller, right? So make sure you're not picking a battle so you can go look like the hero to your seller.
Well, and in the end, oftentimes if it is $50,
Right.
like I would look at the seller and go, okay, it's $50. Are you willing to move it forward for $50? And if they're saying no, I'm probably put that in. You know what I mean? It's just,
Right.
but that's the way how I operate. But I just think the more you communicate with them about where you're coming from,
Yep.
the less you can have of that emotion. And then when they present to the seller, their emotions are not strung high based on you having sent this thing that they feel is completely way out.
Right, right. So again, what Lynn was saying is going on with the script is it's also how you present it. When we get a repair procedure that's out of whack, so to speak, I'm gonna sit down. I'm gonna say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, as by the way, you should prepare your seller for this. Okay, don't if you get a repair procedure, this is what I say to sellers every time we have a repair procedure. That's the good news. We're agreeing ahead of time on what you have to do. Great, that's wonderful. I've said that. I can almost promise you they're going to ask for things that are outside the scope of the repair procedure. So we just need to not react poorly to that. And let's address it when we get there. Because a lot of times it's something small and you'd be willing to do it. But if you're not, that's fine. But just prepare them. So now when you sit down, good news is we got the repair requests. We got the notice. There's two lists on here. One's required. And then there are some that, in my opinion, and according to the contract, are not required. Here are the ones that are required. Here are the ones that you can consider doing should you want to do so. If you say no to these, you're fully within your right in the contract. Again, goes back to what Lynn was saying. A lot of times the sellers are like, that's fine. I'll do it. I don't, for me, it's not the end of the world to spend an extra $50. I'm selling a $400,000 house.
And then everybody feels good, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This one always gets tricky because I know there are a lot of people, and there may be some that are in here. Listen, if you want to go battle for this and say, hey, listen, they sent us 2 lists. You absolutely don't have to do this here. You only have to do this. And I recommend you do that. That is well within your right to do so. I'm not here to tell you how to run your business by any stretch of the imagination. That being said, let's all get to the same closing table and be happy. Right. All right. So as is, this is the last one that we don't often see this. This is brand new. This is the one that basically says, hey, I'm going to buy the house and I'm going to get it inspected. And I'm going to look at it. Doesn't matter what the inspection finds. Doesn't matter what comes up. I'm just doing it for informational purposes only. Oh, sorry.
Angie, you want to unmute? Angie, you want to unmute? Ask her if she'll unmute.
Angie,
There she goes.
okay, there.
She's unmuted.
All right, Angie, what was your question?
Okay, back on the repair procedure. It was my understanding that when you're negotiating the contract to start with, if the seller agrees to repair procedure, then he is agreeing to make any seller paid repairs. But it says in this paragraph, if the seller does not timely respond or does not agree to make all the seller paid repairs within 2 calendar days, of course, they could terminate or renegotiate. So he still has the option to
Yeah.
say, no, I'm not going to fix those seller paid
Yeah.
repairs.
Yes. Yeah. Great clarification. So yeah, it's kind of like it's similar to the appraisal contingency. They have the option to fix. And if they decide they will fix those repairs that are covered, then everybody has to move forward. However, if they decide not to do it, they don't have to, but the buyer can then be released from the contract and get their earnest money back.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, they're not.
I've been in Georgia. I've been selling in Georgia the last 15 years, and we only do due diligence. So this is new.
It's only a matter of time before this whole still having repair procedure option. I have no idea why we did it. It's only a matter of time before you have due diligence. Yeah.
Okay.
We like to take our time to make sure everybody's happy. We don't want to annoy anybody. So we just make sure everyone's happy for a while and super confused. And then eventually we'll be at due diligence. Great clarification.
Thank you.
That said, do you agree that the repair procedure holds the seller to a higher standard of making repairs than does due diligence?
So the question was, would you agree that the repair procedure holds the seller to higher standards than due diligence
Of making repairs?
of making repairs? Not really, because in due diligence, they can ask for anything, right? I mean, you'd be at a higher,
The buyer
well,
can ask for anything,
the-
but the seller isn't obligated to do anything.
they're not, but this buyer can easily get out.
Right, no, I'm asking the seller.
Right. So, it depends on what you mean by a higher standard.
That there's more of a ethical obligation. There's a little bit more of a, I've had someone.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I've
it
had-
does.
yeah.
It does make, so how I would word that, I would say it does make the seller more committed to make sure the house is in better condition than, say, a due diligence one. They don't
Right.
have to do it.
Right, but yeah.
They're leveraged less though in the due diligence, so they may be forced to do it if they want to. So the challenge with due diligence is then you're probably end up being forced to do a lot more nitpicky things than you want to,
Yeah.
right? Because then you get down to what happens is, are they really going to walk over, the fascia board not being painted the same color? The answer is maybe, right? I mean, people have walked over silly things. So, but yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it does mean they're a little more committed to doing stuff to make the house work. All right. They don't have to. They don't have to. Yep. All right, Angie, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Okay, so I was looking over a friend of mine's contract from Ohio or something, and I saw a stipulation that the buyer's agent, who was actually Keller Williams' agent, had put in there, they were using due diligence, but she had put in there to kind of make it a better deal for the seller, that the buyer will not ask for any repairs up to $1,500 or something like that. So that kind of eliminates all the nitpicking. And I think that's a good thing to discuss with your buyer up front. Look, we'll do this. And if anything major comes back, yes, we'll ask, but let's don't be nitpicky. Let's say, you're not going to pass up this deal over $1,500 worth of small items.
Yeah. So
I thought that was really kind of a good stipulation to put in there if you're trying to fight for due diligence for your buyer.
yeah, and I agree. I agree with the concept. I get a little nervous about writing in a stipulation on that. I mean, I'm not saying don't do it. Don't do it unless you have an attorney do it. But what I do 100% agree with you on is from a buyer consultation standpoint, you absolutely should have that discussion with your buyer. Say, listen,
Right.
there is no perfect house. So if you go out
Yeah.
there and you want every single thing fixed, it's going to be a lot harder. I'm not saying I want to ask again. You always want to be representing them, but going in with due diligence, you're not doing it just so you can have an easy out on stupid things. Like you want to make sure that you have a house that you like, but also understand some things are worth it and some things are not.
Especially in a multiple offer situation, might be a great suggestion to the buyer.
Right.
Diligence is meant to help you.
And that's kind of what Lynn was saying. That's also what the due diligence fee can kind of help with as well, to say, okay, I'm willing to do this, and as long as the repairs are less than whatever my due diligence fee is, then I'm going to stick with it. But if they're more than that, then I'm going to, that kind of helps get the same agreement in there.
We also saw.
You can beat them up on price, or you can beat them up on repairs, and often not both.
Yeah.
We also saw them as the market tightened up in due diligence. The due diligence fee was 1%, and the earnest money became the lesser of the two. So if you are truly trying to get something and you want due diligence and the option to walk away,
Mm-hmm.
you can use that.
Okay.
You have to make sure your buyer knows, okay, you can do that, and it's gonna make your offer super strong, but God forbid you find there's something wrong. They don't have to agree to do it. They don't agree.
Right.
You're leaving the money on the table if you walk away.
Right.
But it is a way to help strengthen
Yep.
that contract and multiple offer. We have another question.
Okay.
If you were in due diligence and submit a repair addendum, does that put you in repair procedure?
No. So the question, if you didn't read it or you couldn't hear Lynn, is if you're in repair procedure or if you're in due diligence and you submit a repair addendum, does that put you in repair procedure? No. What this does remind me of, though, and I see this all the time. Huh? Right. Once you sign it, the repair addendum was actually designed specifically for due diligence. It wasn't designed for repair procedure, because when you sign it, it specifically says due diligence has been removed. Here's what I see a lot of is we're in repair procedure. We submit the repair request through the repair addendum, which is fine. I mean, it's very organized, but you put a deadline on that addendum. That deadline has absolutely no weight in the contract at all. Yep, none at all. You cannot unilaterally put a deadline on a response. Okay, so let's go back to this. So right here, you have your repair procedure. You have until this date right here to submit any requests to them. So let's say this date doesn't matter. Let's say this date is next Monday at 6. But you submit the repair procedure today. There is, because it's designed to be an addendum to close due diligence. It's not designed for repair procedure. I'm not saying don't use it. I do like it because it's very clean. But there's a deadline, an expiration of offer, because it's exactly what it is. It's an offer, a new offer basically on what's going to be done on the property. What I see a lot is people are in repair procedure. They'll submit the repair addendum today, and they'll put that they want to hear back by Friday at 6. And then they'll start blowing up my phone Friday morning and say, if you don't answer by 6 today, wrong. Absolutely not. I have until this date right here, this new expiration date you've put in the addendum. I've never agreed to that. So you can tell me all day long that you're going to rescind this repair addendum if I don't answer by 6. That's totally fine. It doesn't matter though. I still have the right and obligation to answer you by this date. And if I answer saying I'm going to do whatever you put on there, you still have to purchase the house. You have the, well, no, you have the specific date right here.
Always go with the original contract.
Yes.
Or should we just put, so you always, on that the repair request always has to match that date, or you just put a line through it?
Yeah, so it either has to match the date or you just leave it blank. It's not applicable. It's literally in a repair procedure situation, it's a document. It's a document. Let's do this. Let me table this part, and when we get to the end, I'll go pull up the repair procedure, so we can see, or the repair addendum, so you can see between the two what I'm talking about. All right. Due diligence we talked about. Termination as is. Okay. Inspections. I'm going to kick it into high gear a little bit because we're running out of time. And like I said, what we might do is instead of waiting longer, we'll come back and continue on this one. Paragraph 9 is basically your inspection and your inspection rights. Basically, it says buyer and a South Carolina licensed insured inspectors reasonably perform any reasonable, ultimately non-destructive examination and make reasonable record of the property with a reasonable notice to the seller. Now it says buyer and South Carolina licensed and insured inspectors. This does come into what about the argument that they don't necessarily have to have an inspector. In due diligence, you still can get out for any reason at all, right? But if you want to go through repair procedure and you want to have it requested, it does need to be by a licensed inspector. Seller agrees to make the property accessible. Seller agrees to grant buyer permission to connect the utilities. Very rarely would I ever say that's a good idea. If you've got bank-owned property or you've got a vacant property and the power's off, and will they give permission to the buyer to put on their utilities? We're starting to get this, and I think we'll start to get it more. Should you put it in your name as the agent? That's the last resort. If the buyer wants to do it, let them do it. But if you as the agent are requested to do it by the seller, come see me. Basically, this also says that the buyer will hold harmless, indemnify, pay damages and attorney fees to seller or brokers of all claims, injuries, damages, yada, yada, yada. This was added, by the way, quite possibly because of a lawsuit that we were involved in, where we had a buyer who was looking through a property, went up into the attic and fell through the attic, and then sued us as the buyer's agent, sued the seller. By the way, that buyer purchased 2 other properties with our agent after that incident, and then came back and sued us 2 years later. Aren't attorneys fun? What? We settled. So the buyer did. He got a lot of cash.
What did he sue?
The argument was that it was the agent's obligation to warn the buyer of the risk of stepping on drywall in the attic. By the way, the agent was never up in the attic. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Now, I would argue that lawsuits like that happen because of a breakdown in communication between, by the way, that agent, when we did get sued, was not with us, which is typically how all of it works. It ends up being a breakdown in communication and something went awry between the agent and the client and other things. No, it was covered by E&O. It was errors and omissions. The insurance company paid it. Okay, paragraph 10, appraised value. It either is or is not contingent upon appraisal. If it is contingent on appraisal and the appraisal comes in low, if the seller agrees to lower the price, everyone has to buy the property. Well, the buyer has to buy the property. They are not obligated to lower it though. So if you have a contract for $300,000, it comes in at $275,000. Buyer's like, well, it's not, the house values are going down or whatever. And the seller says, doesn't matter. I'll take $275,000. It states right here, the seller they need to move forward and purchase the property. Wood infestation report. All right. This is another fun one we're seeing right now. So basically this says it's contingent on the home being inspected for the CO 100. It either is or is not contingent on it. It's either paid, it's paid for, it's chosen by one party and it's paid for by one party. If I'm the seller and they're asking for me to pay for it and then to choose it, I'm going to put a stipulation on a cap on price. Typically what happens is the buyer will ask the seller to get it and the seller to choose and seller to pay. It's my advice as your broker, if you're representing the buyer, you should advise your buyer to pick and pay for the CO 100. It is their representative. It's no different than the inspection. I would not want a seller picking and paying for an inspection on their property to tell me it's worthy of buying. I feel the same way about the CO 100. You choose your person, they represent you, you go in there. It says in here, it's very similar to the repair procedure. In the event something needs to come up or something needs to be done to clear the CO 100, this elusive clear, that the seller, if they agree to do it, the buyer still moves forward. We just ran into this last week. This does not mean if this is what happened. We were represented the buyer. We went under contract. CO 100 inspection was done. They actually found active termites, and so they wanted it was a townhome community. They wanted it to be obviously taken care of, but then they also wanted a bond and a full-time continued treatment. And the HOA doesn't do that. And the buyer was like, "There's active termites in there. Why I would just have it repaired or taken care of and no further guarantee? Why would I do that?" I totally understand that question, but this says as long as they take care of it and they clear the CO 100, the buyer has to move forward. Yeah, and it's then up to the buyer to do so.
Are they still sending?
Yes. So why do you ask that?
I was going to tell you a story.
Oh, okay. Oh, you don't want Gene to yell at you for that. I'm just kidding, Gene. Gene's probably not gonna like me. One of the things that we are seeing quite often in this is if you're representing a buyer, don't use your negotiation bandwidth of the repair procedure or the due diligence with CO 100 stuff. I see this all of the time. Someone comes in, they get the inspection done, they get the CO 100 done, and they ask for all of it at one time. If the CO 100 letter needs to be cleared, that's separate. Negotiate repairs first, and then have the CO 100 done. So you come back. The seller's obligated to pay to get the CO 100 repairs done. And as a listing agent, if you submit repairs for the CO 100 and anything else at the same time, I'm going to tell the seller, agree to everything that's covered, that's on the CO 100, and then we'll strike anything on here, because in a negotiation situation, they're going to see me agreeing to all of this. I see it all the time. And it's a giant waste of bandwidth when it comes to negotiations. So make sure you should have them done separately for that. And by the way, and it states this in this contract, as well as your buyer's agency agreement, as well as the listing agreement, you are not an inspector. So if you go in and the inspector comes and says, oh, there's some moisture damage there, you then can't say, well, that'll be covered in the CO 100, or let's wait for the CO 100. So you want to have that actual inspection done so you can request it. But when it's obvious, when there's obvious CO 100 issues and you waste the bandwidth in the negotiation, you're just missing an opportunity for your buyer to possibly get more in that negotiation time. This basically runs the same as the repair procedure. If the seller does not agree to do it, the buyer can either accept the property and move forward if the bank will let them. They can renegotiate, or they can terminate the contract. All right. So let's see. We had one question pop up. I missed what you said in regards to the appraisal. If the home appraises lower than the agreed upon purchase price, the seller has to lower, correct? Just want to make sure I understood that. All I heard was the seller doesn't have to lower. Okay, so here's what happens. If it appraises lower, the seller does not have to lower the price. However, should they choose to lower the price, the buyer does have to continue forward with the transaction. But no, they are not obligated to lower their price if it comes in low. Buyer can back out if they don't agree to lower it. But if they do agree to lower it, buyer stays in.
What are you seeing in the way of, for cash deals? How many are roughly, are still subject to appraisal?
So the question was, how many cash deals are we seeing roughly still subject to appraisal? This has always kind of been my philosophy. If I've got enough cash to purchase a house, I've got enough financial savvy to still want that house to appraise. Right. So I'm not, just because, unless I'm in a multiple, unless it's a super, super unique property and I just absolutely want it as a cash buyer, I'm still going to want it to appraise because it's an investment. Now, that being said, you start looking at some luxury properties, real, unique properties, you may see, hey, cash not contingent on appraisal.
Yeah, I'm doing it 2.2 and they're less than
Right.
we look at the market and they just.
Right.
Okay. Which is kind of, I think we're just buying.
Yeah. Yeah. On a luxury property, again, they don't care about the appraisal.
Cash and committed.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, but when we're looking, because we've seen this quite a bit in the sub 750, and it's like, well, let's, if it's cash, then it won't be contingent on appraisal. Well, that's two separate things, right? It's so, and by the way,
Business savvy.
right. And here's the deal. What you also want to be, and we've seen this, is don't be duped by a buyer that says, well, I don't care if it appraises, but it's getting financing, right? Because if you've got a finance contingency, but then it's not contingent on appraisal, but you can't get financing because it didn't appraise, then you can't get financing. Like, they're separate from each other. So be careful on that. You don't see it often, but you also don't, in the whole thing of, well, we'll do it non-contingent on appraisal, and if they really want it, can we get them to pay the difference? Well, lenders a lot of times, depending on the type of financing, don't just let them pay the difference, right? So it's not as black and white as a lot of sellers would like it to be. All right, let's see how we can fly through. We're going to go a couple minutes late, but I think we'll be able to cover everything. So paragraph 12, survey, title, examination, elevation, insurance. So basically it says we recommend that the buyer have it surveyed, they get title insurance, and that they have, they research the elevation on it, the flood insurance, and that they get insurance even if it's not required. Like, that's basically what this is saying. We recommend all of this. Survival says if any part of the contract is not observed, kept, or performed after the closing, it will survive the closing and remain binding upon the parties hereto until fully observed, kept, or performed. For example, what this basically is saying, if your seller agreed to fix the garage door and it wasn't done by closing, they're still obligated to do it after closing. As the listing agent, once you close on your property, you've lost all leverage, or excuse me, as the buyer's agent, once you've closed on the property, you've lost all leverage to have that fixed. That's wonderful that the survival paragraph says they're still required to fix it. You ain't got any leverage. So if there's something big that needed to be done, use the closing as your leverage. They are required to perform by closing. This is just saying in the event for whatever reason something came up they didn't do, they're still required after the fact. Yes.
Two things come up. So let's say, according to all the dates and everything, they were supposed to have all the repairs made by X date so that we could reinspect.
Mm-hmm.
We go out to do the reinspection and they don't have the repairs done. They say, oh yeah, we're going to get them done in the next 5 days, but you've had a reinspection. How do you your advice on that?
So if you go out and the question was, you go out and reinspect and the repairs weren't done yet. Well, if you have the repair addendum that has then been signed, it specifically stipulates what happens if that doesn't, if you go out there, hasn't been done, then you have so much time to put them on notice. And then if they don't do it, I'll have to look at the repair addendum on there.
Yeah, there's a couple of dates.
Yeah. And,
They didn't do anything and we had a reinspection because there was so much.
right.
And they things you have there. And the reinspection came and was like, they didn't do anything.
Right. Yeah. So if they,
Start over again.
yes.
And you pay for your buyers, pay for that, and you have to pay again.
Right. So the question is what happens if they haven't done it? Well, at that point, and by the way, in a lot of these, you're a representative, but not an attorney. So when they start getting to a breach of contract thing, you want to start engaging the attorney. Typically what will happen on that one is they'll push the closing. From a buyer's agent standpoint, I'm pushing the closing. Like you have not performed. You have not done what you agreed to do. I know the survival paragraph is there. We're not closing. I would not advise a buyer to close on there. Now, if the buyer's in a binding situation, they ultimately have the say in that. And then you have it pushed. And a lot of times you can start to say, in order to agree to extend this, it's going to cost this. And you may have to start negotiating some additional monies at that point.
And what is the best way to have that money? Because as we've discussed, the seller can't give them money at closing.
Right.
That's not legal anymore.
Right.
Unless it's a cash deal. But so what's the resolve? How do you resolve that?
So the resolve on this, let's just say it just comes down to it and the seller is just not going to do anything. You could work with the attorney. The attorneys are being less and less open to this. So you can work with the attorney to hold a certain amount in escrow. And you can actually have an agreement that would say, you could send a contractor out there to get a quote, and they'll have an agreement that says, based on this quote, we'll hold $1,500 in escrow. And then once completed and once authorized by the buyer, it'll be paid directly to the inspector. Challenge on that, though, is if you get into any repairs that are then going to flag the financing. So the lender, by the way, is if they see this, repairs aren't done, they're going to have to see that agreement, then they may flag it and say, we're not closing until the repairs are done.
Is there any other avenue when you're at closing date and you don't have any stuff? Like if you go, you close and you realize that you're going to the closing table and there's a major problem.
No. I mean, the question was, is there any other avenue? And at that point, it's going to be either holding money in escrow or delaying closing. By the way, from a buyer's standpoint, I still want to delay closing, because even if they've agreed to fix. The challenge with holding money in escrow is, let's just say it's a repair procedure and they agreed to fix the HVAC because it was not properly cooling. And their whole time they're thinking it's a Freon issue. And then finally you say, okay, fine, we'll just give us $500. It'll replace the Freon when we go out there. And then you get out there and it's not a Freon issue. Well, now all of a sudden you got $500 to replace an air conditioner. But if you push the closing, they get out there, it's not a Freon issue, and the AC is still not properly functioning, then they may have to replace it at that point. Again, you lose your leverage when you close. So just be careful on that. By the way, I want to be very clear, because there's maybe there's still hopefully some people on here. Don't let any of this freak out. Like, this isn't like go to the contracts class and then you're expected to just miraculously know it. By the way, this is why I'm here. So when these situations come up, just call me or shoot me an email, because there's no one situation that has the same result. All right, 14 basically says a home warranty is going to be covered, where ordered by whom, paid by whom, and what company you're going to use. It also is if you're not going to put it on here. By the way, if you're not going to get one, you need to have not checked, because then you have your buyer has initialed that they're not getting one, which means they know that they have the option to get one. It also discloses here that brokers may receive a fee for selling a home warranty, or recommending a home warranty. So that's already disclosed there. Fire, casualty, or injury. Basically, if anything happens to the property during the time of being under contract, you have a couple different options. You can accept the property and still move forward as the buyer. You can negotiate to take the proceeds from any insurance claims that are done, or you can cancel the contract. Paragraph 16 basically says that you've agreed. The first part says buyer and seller agree that the seller has delivered prior to the contract a property condition disclosure statement, and that to everyone's knowledge that the buyer or the seller has been honest. Or it's not, they agree that the seller will not complete it, and that the buyer has sole responsibility to inspect the property. Here's the deal. I quite honestly find property condition disclosures to be a colossal waste of energy, because they're only as effective as the person filling it out, right? And that's no judgment on people filling it out. What happens often is you get into this battle of, you get an inspection done and it's like, well, that was there and they didn't disclose it and they clearly knew. This paragraph says they're disclosing it to the best of their knowledge. Don't come back at me on that. Now, where you will see, and where it is kind of you do have a bit of an obligation as a listing agent, is if you have a property condition disclosure that says something like flood insurance is not required, and then they go and they get under contract and then they find out that it is required and you have it. Well, now they've purchased it, they've gone under contract, in its repair procedure, but they were doing it because they went by your property disclosure that says flood insurance was not required. They do have grounds to terminate at that point and get their earnest money, because it could be misrepresentation, because clearly you knew it was required, you had it. So that's the area that we do see on that, and you know, just be careful on that one.
I had a transaction where they said there's no flood insurance if they were paying flood insurance.
Yeah, it's, and they just, and again,
And
this
they
is,
were doctors. I mean,
they just were filling it out. I don't know. I mean, it's,
but this went after they filled it out. They still said no.
oh, yeah, that's,
Mhm.
so lead-based paint, paragraph 17, only applies to houses that are built prior to 1978. Basically what this says is if it was built prior to 1978, there may be lead, and you've been given the lead-based paint information, and that you know that it's a risk, and it's not anybody's fault but your own if you get sick from it. Sexual offender or criminal information, basically it says that the broker is not responsible for providing this information to the buyers or the sellers. So if it's information they want, they need to get it on their own. Trust account, interest, charitable contribution. This is where they are giving permission for their earnest money to be put in an interest-bearing account. I will tell you, I've yet in all of my time to meet an escrow agent who has an interest-bearing account, because the accounting behind that is so complicated. I mean, not saying it isn't there, but I would default to no on this one unless you know differently from the escrow agent. Paragraph 20 says that if they're a non-resident, that they will have an income tax on this if it is an investment property. So this is a disclosure on there that this could be automatically taken out by the attorney. Entire and binding agreement, the merger clause. Basically it says the parties agree that this contract expresses the entire agreement between parties, and that there is no other agreement, oral, otherwise, modifying the terms, and the contract is binding on parties as principals, heirs, personal representatives, blah, blah, blah. What this says is that there is no other agreement outside of this agreement as it relates to this transaction. Example, there is no pre-occupancy agreement, right? Unless it's disclosed on here. There is no agreement to rent back without it being disclosed on here. There's no agreement to pay a certain amount outside of closing. This is the entire agreement here. Paragraph 22, adjustments, basically saying that there will be prorations, annual or monthly as appropriate as a closing date, utilities, waste fees, HOA fees, everything will be prorated the day of closing. The day of closing belongs to the seller. The attorney factors all that in. The only thing that, you know, I really give to the buyer or the seller when we do this is really the basic ones of taxes, and HOA fees if we know them. 23 basically gives the ramifications of what happens if you default, if the seller defaults. Their obligations are due. The buyer can do the following. If the buyer defaults, the seller can do the following. Again, all of these enter with recover, or basically they all say what I would say at this point. If they default, you can terminate, but we also at some point need to engage an attorney, because I can tell you what the risk is, but I can't give you legal advice if you default. For instance, we have a seller who was selling, and this just happened in Mount Pleasant recently. They were selling because they were being relocated because of COVID and a job change. They found out 2 weeks prior to closing that their new job fell through. It didn't fall through. They basically backed out on the sellers. Terrible situation. The seller has no desire to sell the house now. They're not selling. We're past every contingency. We're past everything. Their argument is we don't have anywhere to go. We don't have anywhere to live. We were only selling because of this job. The job fell through. We're not closing. Seller's clearly in default of the contract. As terrible as it is, and their situation's clearly in default. We can only advise them. I've spoken with the other broker, who also happens to be the buyer. We've tried everything we can. The seller's offered the money. At the end of the day, the buyer, they want the house, and I get it. At this point, they now have to speak to attorneys. And typically the closing attorney's not going to get involved in that because you're in litigation at that point. You can't. You're bound to sell it. They offered to. They offered to give them the escrow money, reimburse them for inspections, reimburse them for everything. The buyers have a contract on the house. Yeah, but at that point, it's litigate to enforce. I will tell you, I've never seen anyone sued to purchase a home, to sell a home, or purchase a home for that matter. What will end up happening is some sort of settlement for damages, which would have been probably worked out between us if the buyer would just say, hey, but I get it. I mean, they love the house, so.
Also, the buyer's representing themselves.
Yeah.
And you've lost that.
Yeah. We're our own worst clients.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We are our own worst clients. Mediation. So basically what this says is, should something like that happen, you agree to mediate before you agree to sue. So in this one, we have said, you know, look, let's go to mediate this one. They're not interested in mediating it. That says that this is what they will take as their first option. I'll be honest with you, just because as a nerdy professional standards person, I think this is an interesting case to see whether or not it's an ethical violation by the buyer, because they're obligated to mediate by being a member of the association. So I wonder if they don't. So anyway, some of you are like, go on with the contract. Paragraph 25 basically says you haven't, the buyer and the seller have not relied on anything that you've said as an agent as the sole reason that they entered into this contract. That they have been given all the education from everyone, but they are making a free and willing decision to go into this binding contract. Broker disclaimer basically says, I'm a broker, I don't give any warranty to anything. Condition of the property, the HVAC, the condition of the property, off-site conditions, schools, title, fitness of the particular purpose of the property, zoning, anything. I don't know any of that. That's why we hire so many other people to do all these inspections and have our due diligence. 27 basically says everyone's agreed that the closing attorney will use the settlement funds from the seller to pay the broker's commissions. That was negotiable and not preset, and everyone has agreed to that. Paragraph 28, attachments, other contingencies, terms. So it gives a list of some things that may be on here. We finally do have a contract where you can actually have an entire contract that covers basically every situation without having a contingency. However, some things that would be on here would be a kick-out clause, or contingent on a home selling. What was the one we talked about the other day? Backup clause. Yeah. Sean's actually had them all in the last week. Seller possession after closing, buyer possession before closing. Any of those can go on there, but you really can do everything now in a typical real estate transaction without having separate addendums on there. Should you put something in here to attach, I would go as far, if I'm the buyer's agent or if I'm countering as a seller's agent, I would go as far as having whatever form you type in here, have that initialed, just so you know that everyone acknowledges that we're having a form attached to this that's outside the 9-page document. Notice and delivery. This is an important paragraph because notice is any unilateral communication, offers, counteroffers, acceptance, terminations, unilateral requests for better terms, and associated addendums. This is from one party to the other. So basically notice and delivery is described as those. It also does say that they are going to be delivered to the email and to the person that's listed on page 9 of the contract, which we'll get to. So you want to make sure that when you get an offer submitted, that they have your correct email on there, right? So for instance, just as an example, when I moved over to the BIC roll over here, it defaulted to the Market Center's email. Had somebody sent me a notice there because it was on this contract, I can't say I didn't get it. They've sent me that notice. So you want to make sure whatever email they put on page 9 is the actual one you will receive them. Paragraph 30 basically just says that there's potential criminal activity when it comes to wiring or exchange of funds and closings, and they're basically they should comply with all federal guidelines to protect themselves, even when signing agency agreements and that sort of thing. It's basically a disclosure. Beware, there are bad people out there, and so if we disclose that, you can't come after us if bad people do any of that. Just as a side note on this, we've really seen an uptick in wiring or wire fraud stuff. A fairly large local attorney. What happened is, though, they got into the Gmail account of our agent, who was also the buyer, and they cloned an email from the buyer's attorney saying, "Hey, we've changed the wiring instructions. Please find those attached." Luckily, our agent is also an attorney and a buyer. It's fun. She just kind of red flagged that and called them. So just know that no closing attorney, very few of them will send wiring instructions via email. None of them change wiring instructions via email. They will absolutely give you a phone call. You should advise your buyer or anyone wiring money to call and have a physical conversation with whomever they're wiring money to confirm over the phone that this is where they're wiring it. Expiration of offer basically means that when I submit this offer to you, you have until this certain time to respond. it says it will automatically expire as no action is taken by either party 30 calendar days after the offer submittal. I don't know what that means, because it just seems weird that they're giving you an additional 30 days that it'll expire automatically. I guess this is saying if it's not filled out. Sorry, I was confused on that one. If this is not filled out, it automatically expires after 30 days. In a multiple offer situation, I see a lot of times that buyer's agents will put a short response time as a negotiation tactic. I will tell you, as a listing agent, that very rarely is effective. If you've got a very popular, especially in this market, if you've got a home that goes on the market tomorrow and they've got 15 showings over the weekend, and buyer agent that shows it tomorrow says, hey, I want to know by the end of the day, Friday, the seller's staring at 15 more showings, they're going to say, okay, then I'm not going to respond to you. So just a side note, you can still try it if you think it works, but a lot of times it doesn't.
So what would you recommend putting your-
So the question was, what should we put? I'd call the listing agent. So I'm submitting an offer. What's the situation? What's the most convenient for your seller? Obviously, we want to be the first. We'd love you to consider it before you take any other offers, but we also know what's going to happen. All right, that's pretty much it. Basically, it says the contract is executed. It's true to the best of their knowledge. Everyone's been honest on this. If you do have a power of attorney, by the way, it does need to be attached and be delivered, or to be delivered within certain calendar days. We have one right now where the husband's overseas and the wife has power of attorney. Technically, they're obligated to either attach it or deliver it to everyone so we have it on file to negotiate. Buyer seller information, and then the last page is buyer agent email. This is where I talked about earlier with the notification. Whatever email address you put here is the official notification address for any unilateral notifications done throughout the transaction. All right. So, questions? How many people still down here? Wow, we only lost like 3 people from the beginning. That's good. You vote with your feet. All right. Did I miss any in here? All I heard is seller doesn't lower. Okay. Questions. What questions do you have? That means I covered it. Your contract ninjas.
Hey, I have a question.
Okay.
So we kind of run into this sometimes. If the buyer sends in repair request before the date that's on the contract, they get the inspection done, it's early, they send in repair request early, our seller responds pretty early. How long then, and how do we decide, I guess, how long the buyer has to basically tell us that they accept our counter, or to, send us back another counter, that sort of thing?
Great question. So hold on, let me make sure. So as I'm reading it, let me reshare this. This is actually one I may need to get some good clarification on, because it's kind of hit me earlier. So as I'm reading it, sellers, so your question, if I understand correctly, is okay, the buyer submitted it, the seller responded or didn't respond, but it was all done early. When this 2 calendar days is from what? Is that what your question is?
So I think, let's see, the 2 calendar days is if the seller does not timely respond. We've had it where the buyer sends in the repair request, a few days before their deadline, and then we respond the very next day, which is well before our deadline as the seller. And then we just don't know, I guess, how long the buyer has to respond. So I have sellers that are asking, when do they have to respond by? And I truly do not know the answer to that question.
So it's the same. It's the 2 calendar days, because if it does not timely respond or does not agree to make all the seller repairs, right? So it would argue at that point your response is whether or not you are agreeing to do it, right? So this brings up the confusion of the repair addendum being used, because quite honestly, you really just have to put a unilateral notice. Here are the things that are covered under paragraph 8. And the seller is either going to say, I agree to paragraph 8 or I do not. Now, to cover yourself from the seller standpoint, what you could do in this point, let's use your situation here and say, you as the seller, you received the repair procedure, and did you counter at all, or did you just agree to everything that was on there?
So if we agree to everything on that's on there, then it's pretty much ratified at that point. If we agree to everything they asked for, we just understood that as being ratified, and we don't really worry to hear back from them. They just typically confirm they got it. But like if we counter back, so there's a lot of times where we're under repair procedure. They ask for repair procedure items and then some other items, and we'll counter. And most of the time, we're agreeing to all of the seller responsibility repairs under repair procedure, but then also some of the other ones. But then we will take other items out that aren't under repair procedure.
Right.
And then my sellers are just like, I just want to know if they're like in agreement, and I explained to them, I said, we fulfilled our part of it. We've agreed to the repair procedure items. But still, sometimes we have buyers that are like, well, if you're not changing out the carpet, I'm not buying it.
Right. Okay. So first of all, this is a great question because this is good clarification. So from your standpoint, what I would do is when you reply, since they gave it to you on the repair procedure, I would reply with the countered repair procedure, but in your email, you put sellers agree to repair all required repairs addressed in paragraph 8. I've also attached the repair procedure addendum that you sent, noting which items, or noting said items, right? So
Okay.
that way what you've done is you've given notice at that point, which is the email that says seller will agrees to repair all required items in paragraph 8.
Okay.
So that you don't technically need a response. Now, what I would do is I would still push to say, I want to make sure we're on the same page here.
Right.
But you've met your obligation. And at that point, especially, quite honestly, at that point, if they don't respond or anything, you've already agreed to do it. So you can't then also at that point say, well, you didn't say anything within 2 days, so it's as is. You've agreed to do it at that point.
Right.
But if they come back, they really have lost any leg to stand on at that point. Not to say they won't try. They'll do exactly what you said. They'll still ask for the carpet to be changed. But you've performed at that point. Yeah.
I think our seller's main question is we just want to know, that they've agreed to move forward with what we sent back.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, like I said, we do have people that'll back out even after we agree to all of the repair procedure items. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. What was your comment?
I said, so they can't back out because they agree.
Well, so the statement was they can't back out because they agree. They can still try to back out. They'd be at risk of losing their earnest money. Yep. Any other questions? All right. So in respect to time, because we've run over and I apologize for that, if you're interested and you want to stay, I was going to pull up the repair addendum and show you what I meant on the conflict of days. But you won't hurt my feelings if you sign off. Clearly 10 of you already have, but kidding. So no, this isn't wonderful. All right. So we're zooming here. So typically what will happen is you'll be in repair procedure. And when you're in repair procedure, you have, let's go back to that paragraph. You have these two dates right here. You have when the inspection and repairs will be submitted, right? So going back to the question that just was, and then when the seller can respond, right? So just for giggles, let's say they had to be submitted by today at 6. So they submit them today, the 10th at 6. And let's say the contract said that they have to respond by Friday at 6, which by the way, in my opinion, is not enough time. You want to give your seller a couple days to do the research of what all the repairs will entail. But for the example, we're going to say the first date was Wednesday, June 10th at 6. The second day is Friday, June 12th at 6. What happens a lot of times is the buyer's agent will use this to submit the repairs for repair procedure. And what they'll do is they'll put a date here on expiration of offer, right? It's not highlighting where I want it to, but you get the point. This does not matter. This date does not matter to the seller. You cannot change.
Then why is it in the contract?
Because it's used for, okay, so the question is why is it in the contract? Because honestly, this is not designed to be used during repair procedure. This form here is designed for due diligence. Yeah.
Wow.
So, because repair procedure, if you go back to the actual verbiage of repair procedure, it's a notice situation, right? Repair procedure says all notices to be sent, right? Completed inspections and requests shall be sent, right? So you're basically sending the request or the notice, and then you're basically giving notice agreeing to or not agreeing. Technically, this could be done via email, as the contract states. Buyer's agent can send an email and saying X, Y, and Z was found on the inspection report. Please find attached. Needs to be repaired.
But no one does it.
No one does it that way. And quite honestly, I don't disagree with that because I do like, that being said, I do like this form because this form does give an agreement. The point is though, is if you're the buyer's agent that uses this form, just know this date does not matter. You can't change when the seller has already, when everyone has already bilaterally agreed that this is when I'm going to respond. I see it all the time. I've seen agents get really feisty on this. Say, listen, I put on there, it had to come back. And I was like, that doesn't matter. I've literally had an agent say it's in the addendum. I understand what you're saying at that point, but it doesn't hold water. I, according to the contract, have until Friday at 6.
I thought addendums always superseded that contract.
If they agree. So what Laura said was, I thought addendums always supersede the contract, which they do, but they haven't agreed on it. An agreed upon addendum, right? This would be no different as if the buyer sent you an addendum that said we agree to change the price to $250 instead of $275. That's basically what this is. You're just sending something out there. You can't require them. Yeah. Now you can say I'm going to rescind, what we're asking on this, and we're going to change it. That's fine. You can't amend a contract unilaterally.
Do you prefer, under repair request procedure, do you prefer this form to an addendum?
Addendum would have the same problem because an addendum has an expiration as well.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
So the question was if I prefer this over an addendum for repair procedure. I don't prefer either one. I don't like, and this is a different discussion and probably a can of worms. I'll just say it. I think it's very lazy as an agent to send an inspection report and say repair everything under recommendations or copy and paste and that sort of thing. Like, I think it needs to be, it needs to take the time to put it in here. Now, reference the inspection report, right? Again, you see that more in due diligence.
Like copy and paste from the inspection, like
Mhm.
that sentence, repair this.
Yeah, but don't put in, and here's the other thing, and I see this a lot, is you get an inspection report back, it says HVAC is, 5 years past its life expectancy, recommend licensed HVAC inspector inspect. That's not a seller's job. Like, don't request that as a buyer's agent. That's the buyer's job during due diligence. Like, if I'm a seller and now if it's due diligence, okay, maybe you can request that. But if you do it in repair procedure and it said no opinion, have someone else inspect it, that is not the seller's job. That your part of your due diligence is to ask for repairs, not ask for inspections. You're the one, it specifically says in there, the buyer and licensed inspectors should inspect the property.
So can I ask you a question about due diligence?
Yeah.
Right now, you're 10 days out
Mm-hmm.
to get a home inspection,
Mm-hmm.
to get a survey,
Uh-huh.
to get a CL 100 with a preferred company. I had asked for 3 weeks due diligence. They made it 2, and the inspections will be done on the 20th, and the due diligence is over on the 25th. That absolutely leaves no time.
Mm-mm. It doesn't. I mean, it doesn't leave any time for negotiations
And that's what I shared with the other client, but they just,
with the seller.
the buyer.
Okay. Has your buyer agreed to it yet?
Yep.
I mean, you just gotta.
They have to do due diligence because we've got to make sure there's they can put in up a fence,
Right.
and they're going to walk. But
Right.
They can't put up the fence.
Yeah. I mean, so the question was, we put in a due diligence. We put in for 3 weeks. So you probably contacted the seller before or the inspector, so you knew when that was. So Laura, which by the way, take note of that. If you're negotiating, when you've drawn up the offer, one of your strategies in drawing up the offer is to call the inspector they're going to use and say, when's the soonest you can inspect it? Because that gives you a lot of negotiation room to say, hey, we've already got them tentatively scheduled for this date. And it allows you to dictate what due diligence should be. What happened in this one is Laura did that, which is why they asked for 3 weeks and the seller refused to give them 3 weeks. They wanted 2, but now they only have a 2-day window to inspect and then negotiate. Is that what you're saying? 4-day window. So it's not terrible. It's not ideal though.
I know, and I told the other agent,
Yeah.
you're going to have to hustle. You're going to have to be there right with me because this has got to get locked down.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, obviously Laura needs to submit right away However, then you're at the mercy of the seller. So at that point, you have the two documents ready to go, the notice of termination or the extension. You want to do the extension first, and then if they ignore you, come back for the notice of termination. All right. Anything else? Let's see. Question. Okay, so we had one question, but we'll ask offline. Yeah, if you have any other questions or anything, let me know. 2 hours of contracts. Listen, I'm grateful that you stayed as long as you did. So.
This could be an 8-hour class.
Oh yeah, yeah. All right, everyone. This was recorded,
We're
I
grateful
think.
you kept pushing.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Again, I'm not a big attention to detail person except on the contracts, right? That's a,
I asked
like,
Joseph earlier about it.
yeah.
The irony.
Right. All right. Well, if you don't have anything else, that's it. We're done. Call me with anything. Bye, Zoom land.
Your people.
Huh?